The last train of the week into Silver Pine pulled into the station with a long iron groan, its smokestack coughing black against the bruised November sky. Snow had begun to fall an hour earlier, fine and dry as flour, the kind of snow the high country sent down as a warning before the real storms came rolling off the Front Range. The wooden platform was empty, save for the station master's lantern swinging on a hook by the freight door, and the only sound for a long moment was the slow ticking of the locomotive cooling in the cold. Then the door of the second passenger car opened, and a young woman stepped down onto the boards. She was small, no more than 5 feet and 3 inches, and she carried a single battered leather valise in one gloved hand. Her traveling dress was navy blue wool, the color of deep water, fitted at the waist and cut with a modest high collar trimmed in pale lace. A small cameo brooch sat at her throat, a gift from a mother she barely remembered. Her hair was the color of honey, poured slow over a comb pinned up under a small dark bonnet, with loose waves escaping at her temples. Her eyes were the color of cornflowers in a Pennsylvania July, large and steady, and just a little frightened. Her name was Charlotte Winslow, and she was 22 years old, and she had run away from Philadelphia. She set the valise down on the planks and straightened her shoulders as her father had taught her to stand when she walked into a courtroom for the first time at the age of 14. Chin up, hands folded, eyes forward. A Winslow does not let the world see her tremble. She drew a slow breath of mountain air and tasted pine and wood smoke and something else, something cleaner and sharper than any air he had ever breathed before. Then she waited. The platform stayed empty. 4 o'clock came and went, then half past, then 5. The light behind the western peaks turned the color of cold iron, and the snow began to fall a little heavier, settling on the brim of her bonnet and on the worn leather of her valise. Charlotte stood very still and tried to remember exactly what the letter had said. Mr. C. Bannock will meet you on the platform at 4 o'clock on the 7th of November. Bring only what you can carry. Welcome to your new home in the West. She had folded that letter and tucked it into the lining of her glove the morning she boarded the train in Philadelphia. She had read it perhaps 100 times in the 8 days of travel that followed, and each reading had felt like opening the same door onto the same uncertain room. Now she stood in the cold and wondered if the door had been a mirage all along. It was nearly 5:30 when the station master finally noticed her. He came out of the freight office wiping grease from his hands on a rag, an old man with a face like cracked saddle leather and a beard the color of dirty snow. His name, she would learn later, was Old Dempsey, and he had been minding the Silver Pine station since the rails first reached the valley in 1872. He looked her up and down once, and his expression slid from puzzlement into something like sorrow. "Lord above, ma'am, how long have you been standing out here?" "Since 4. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I am waiting for a Mr. C. Bannock." The old man's face changed at the name. He looked at her again, slower this time, taking in the cut of her dress and the city polish on her boots and the way she held that valise like a shield. Then he shook his head slowly as a man shakes his head over bad news he has been carrying a long time. "Miss," he said gently, "I do not believe young Caleb knows you are coming. The Bannock boys are not the kind of men who keep women waiting on a platform. Not because they are unkind, because they do not generally have women in their lives at all." Charlotte felt the cold of the boards travel up through her boots and into her bones. She did not let her face change. "Could you send word to him?" "I can send a boy up the trail in the morning, but that storm is coming in faster than I would like. Best you come inside by the stove and let me think on this." She let him take her valise. She let him guide her into the small waiting room where a potbelly stove glowed orange in the corner and a single oil lamp burned on a desk piled with telegraph forms. She let him pour her a tin cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the spring thaw. And while she sat there with her gloved hands wrapped around the warmth, the old man went out to send up a smoke signal of some kind. In the past, she had been out running for 8 days, finally caught up to her in the quiet of that little room. She had been her father's only child. Edmund Winslow had been one of the finest contract attorneys in Philadelphia, the kind of man who could read a deed of sale as a preacher, read scripture, who had spent 30 years standing between small farmers and the great railroad combines that ate up their land an acre at a time. Her mother had died of a fever when Charlotte was 10 years old, and after that, her father had raised her in the long quiet of his library, teaching her to read Blackstone's commentaries and the Homestead Act of 1862 in place of needlepoint and of French. By the time she was 14, she could spot a fraudulent water rights clause at 20 paces. By the time she was 18, her father told her in a tired and fond voice that she had the better legal mind in the family. By the time she was 22, he was dead. He had collapsed in his study one March afternoon with a contract still open under his hand. The doctor had called it a failure of the heart. Charlotte had called it the end of the only world she had ever known. What followed had been worse than the grief. Her father's brother, Reginald Winslow, had taken her into his house on Rittenhouse Square the same week of the funeral, and within a month he had announced her engagement to a 60-year-old senator named Halloran, a widower with 3 grown sons and a reputation for cruelty that ran from Harrisburg to Baltimore. Reginald had called it a fine match. He had called it an alliance. He had called it everything except what it was, which was the trade of a girl for a seat on a committee. Charlotte had wept and pleaded and written letters and torn the letters up and written more, and every word of every letter had bounced off her uncle like rain off slate. 2 weeks before the wedding, she had walked into the kitchen at 4 in the morning, pulled a folded newspaper out of the cook's apron pocket, and read by the light of a single candle the advertisement that would change her life. Western brides wanted. Respectable young women of good character needed for homesteaders and ranchers in the Colorado Territory. She had written her reply that same night under a false name. She had emptied the small wooden box of her mother's savings, hidden under the loose floorboard in her bedroom. And on a Tuesday morning when her uncle was at his club, she had walked out of the house on Rittenhouse Square wearing this same navy dress and carrying this same valise, and she had not looked back. The reply she received was signed C. Bannock. The handwriting was young and earnest and full of promises about clean air and honest work and a family that would treat her with respect. She had read it 3 times and decided to believe it. Now the candle was burning low in the station master's lamp, and the snow outside was thickening into something with weight and intent, and the man named C. Bannock was nowhere on the road. The door of the waiting room banged open on a gust of cold wind, and Charlotte rose to her feet before she had decided to. 3 men came in. They came in as mountain men come into anything slow and careful, and taking up more room than the room was made for. The first was the tallest 6 feet and 5 inches at least, with shoulders that filled the doorway, and a long buffalo coat dusted with snow. He wore a dark, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and beneath the brim, his eyes were the color of whiskey held up to a winter window. His jaw was set hard, and there was 2 days of dark stubble along it, and his mouth had the kind of stillness that comes from a man who has not had reason to smile in a long time. Behind him came a second man nearly as tall, fair-haired and broader through the chest, with a rifle slung across his back and a Colt at his hip, and the kind of restless watchfulness that meant trouble for anyone who startled him. And behind that one came the third, the youngest, slimmer than his brothers, but still tall enough to stoop a little under the lintel brown gold hair, curling damp under a scarf, eyes a soft summer blue. The first man spoke without taking his hat off. "Dempsey says there is a woman here waiting on a bannock." Charlotte stepped forward, the lamplight catching the lace at her throat. "That would be me," she said. The whiskey eyes settled on her. The mouth did not change. Behind him, the youngest of the 3 made a small sound, almost a flinch, and his summer blue eyes went very wide. The middle brother turned slowly and looked at the youngest with an expression that promised a reckoning. "I am Elijah Bannock," the tall man said. His voice was low and dry like rocks rolling in a creek bed. "And I do not know who you are." She drew the letter from the lining of her glove and held it out. He took it in a hand that was scarred and weather-darkened and surprisingly careful, and he turned toward the lamp and read. She watched his face. It went through several things while he read. Recognition, disbelief, A slow tightening at the corners of the mouth that she would later come to know as anger held under glass. He folded the letter once and turned very slowly and looked at the youngest brother. Caleb, the youngest swallowed. I can explain. You will. Elijah handed the letter back to Charlotte without looking at her. But not here, Dempsey. When does the next train south come through? The old station master cleared his throat and looked uncomfortable. That is the thing I have been trying to tell you, son. There will not be a train. Not for 2 weeks at the least, maybe the whole winter if the pass closes hard. The weatherman up at Denver wired down an hour ago. The storm coming in tonight is a true one. Silver Pine Pass will be sealed by midnight. The middle brother swore softly under his breath. The youngest looked stricken. Elijah Bannock did not move at all. He stood there in the lamplight with the letter still in his hand and his eyes on some middle distance only he could see, and Charlotte watched the muscles in his jaw work once, twice, 3 times. When he finally looked at her, his eyes had gone very still. Miss Winslow, he said, I owe you an apology you did not earn. My brother had no right to send for you. Our house is no place for a woman of your kind, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I cannot put you out into a Colorado blizzard either, and there is no hotel in Silver Pine fit for a lady, and the boarding house is full of timber crews. So you will come up the mountain with us tonight. You will sleep under a roof, and in the spring when the pass opens, we will see you safely on a train to wherever you wish to go. That is the best I can offer. It was not a kind speech. It was not unkind either. It was the speech of a man who had measured the world a long time ago and found exactly where the lines were. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she lifted her chin as her father had taught her, and she said very clearly, Thank you, Mr. Bannock, I accept. The ride up the mountain was the strangest hour of her life. They put her on a sturdy bay mare and tied her valise behind the saddle of the youngest brother, whose name she now knew was Caleb. The middle one was Jonah, and he rode at the rear with his rifle across his lap and his eyes on the trees. Elijah took the lead. He never looked back at her, but every few minutes she felt his attention drift over her shoulder like the touch of a hand checking. The trail climbed in long switchbacks through stands of ponderosa pine taller than the steeples of any church she had ever seen. The snow fell harder. Her face went numb beneath the bonnet. Her hands inside the gloves stopped feeling like her hands at all. Once when the bay mare slipped on a buried stone and Charlotte gasped, Elijah was suddenly right there at her stirrup, one gloved hand steadying the bridle, the other hovering near her elbow without quite touching. He did not speak. When the mare found her footing again, he simply nodded once and rode on ahead. But she had seen his eyes up close in that moment, and what she had seen there was not the cold thing from the station house. It was something more like a man who had decided long ago not to feel certain things and was discovering against his will that the lock on that particular door was not as strong as he had believed. They came over the last ridge as the last of the daylight was bleeding out of the sky. Below them in a sheltered bowl ringed by a black timber, a single light burned in the window of a long log house. Smoke rose straight from a stone chimney into the falling snow. There was a barn larger than the house and corrals and a small stand of cottonwoods bent under their white burdens. To Charlotte, who had grown up in the gaslight glow of Philadelphia, the place looked like something out of a storybook. It looked like the end of the world. It looked, she realized with a small jolt, a little bit like home. Bannock Ridge, Caleb said softly beside her. It was the first word any of them had spoken in nearly an hour. He sounded both proud and ashamed. This is it. The first night inside that log house was a strange country all its own. The main room ran the full length of the building. A massive stone fireplace at one end gave off a heat that hit her like a wall when she stepped through the door. There was a long plank table flanked by mismatched chairs, a kitchen of cast iron and copper at the far end, and shelves of books along one wall that stopped her in her tracks. Books, real books, dozens of them, leather-bound and well-worn. She would not have expected books in a mountain man's house. Not these mountain men with their rifles and their snow and their long silences. Caleb told the truth then, all in a rush, the way a boy tells the truth when he has been carrying it too long. He had placed the advertisement 3 months ago. He had used his own initial because he had been ashamed to use Elijah's. He had done it because he was watching his oldest brother turn into a ghost in front of his own eyes, watching him sit by the fire at night with a face like a man already in the grave, and he could not stand it. He had not thought about what it would mean for the woman who answered. He had not thought about anything except the chance, however small, that someone might walk through that door and bring his brother back from wherever he had gone. When Caleb finished, Jonah let out a string of words that would have peeled paint and slammed his open palm on the table so hard the oil lamp jumped. Elijah did not speak at all. He stood at the window with his back to the room and watched the snow. Charlotte set her valise down by the door. She felt her face burning, not from the heat of the fire, but from the unbearable fact of standing in a room where three men were having an argument about whether or not she should exist there. She straightened her shoulders. She remembered her father at the long oak table in the library the night before her first moot court, telling her the only weapon a Winslow ever needs is a clear voice in a true sentence. "Gentlemen," she said. They turned, all three of them, the whiskey eyes and the hard amber eyes and the soft summer blue eyes all turning to her at once. "I am not here to marry anyone," she said. Her voice did not shake. "I came west because I was running from a man who was going to ruin my life. I do not need your pity, and I do not need a husband. What I need is a roof until the spring. I will earn it. I can cook. I can clean. I can keep accounts and read contracts and write a letter in 3 languages. I will not be a burden to you. And when the snow goes off the pass, I will be on the first train out, and you will never have to think of me again. That is the offer. Take it or leave it as you please." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Then slowly Elijah Bannock turned from the window and looked at her, and for the first time something moved behind those whiskey eyes that was not anger and was not pain. It was something more like recognition. The look one stranger might give another in a foreign country upon realizing against all odds that they speak the same tongue. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," he said. "It has been closed up for some time. We will air it out in the morning." He did not say what he was thinking, which was that the room at the end of the hall had belonged to a sister named Hannah, and that no one had slept in it since the night they buried her in a churchyard in Chicago 3 years ago. He did not say it because he could not yet say it out loud. But Caleb heard the unspoken thing, and Caleb's eyes filled, and Caleb turned away to feed the fire so no one would see. That was how Charlotte Winslow came to Bannock Ridge. The first week was a long lesson in how little she knew about the world. She learned that the cast iron stove in the kitchen had to be coaxed like a temperamental animal, that wet wood would smoke you out of your own house, that bread dough needed warmer hands than she had ever brought to anything in her life. She learned that the wash water from the well froze on the cloth before you could finish wringing it out. She learned that the men ate 3 times what she had imagined men could eat, and that no matter how much she cooked, Jonah always wanted more and never said thank you. She learned that Caleb would smile at her shyly across the table and bring her small, useful things without being asked an extra blanket, a pair of wool stockings 2 sizes too big that she wore over her own. She learned that Elijah ate quickly and quietly and almost never met her eyes, and that when he did meet them, the look lasted just a beat too long to be polite. She also began to learn things that the men did not know they were teaching her. She noticed, for instance, that Elijah always sat with his back to the wall and his face to the door. Not occasionally, always. It was not the habit of a rancher. It was the habit of a man who had spent years in places where the next person through the door might mean to kill him. She noticed that his boots lying neatly by the hearth at night were not the round-toed work boots his brothers wore. They were narrower and harder, and the heels were worn in a particular pattern she had seen on a certain class of man in Philadelphia, the kind of man her father sometimes hired for the long, quiet work of finding people who did not want to be found. She noticed that every night before he turned in, Elijah pulled a Colt revolver from inside his coat and broke it open and counted the rounds and checked the action, and his hands moved over the gun with the fluency of a violinist moving over the strings of an instrument he has played since childhood. Ranchers handled guns. They did not handle guns like that. She did not say anything. Not yet. But she watched and she filed each small fact away in the part of her mind her father had trained for exactly this kind of work. On the fifth evening, while she was dusting the small upstairs room he used for an office, she found the thing that began to break it open. She had been moving carefully along the bookshelf, lifting each volume so she could wipe beneath when her boot bumped against a corner of black walnut wood under the desk. She knelt down. There was a small chest there, old and beautifully made, and clearly valued, half hidden behind a pair of saddlebags. The lid was not locked. She told herself afterward that she had not meant to open it. She told herself she had only meant to slide it back into its place. But her hand turned the lid, and the lid lifted, and what lay inside stopped her breath. A small silver coin sat on top of a folded oilskin. The coin was no bigger than $50, but it had been struck with a single open eye, and a motto curved beneath it. She knew that motto. Every reader of a Philadelphia newspaper knew that motto. "We never sleep," the badge of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Beneath the coin was a folded clipping from the Chicago Tribune, dated February of 1875. The headline made her hands cold even before she read the words. Pinkerton agent's sister found dead on home porch. Suspect flees into Western Territories. She read the column slowly. A young agent of the Pinkerton Agency working a case involving the smuggling of repeating rifles to outlaw bands in the Wyoming country had come too close to the man at the center of the network. The man had taken his revenge in the most direct possible way. The agent's 16-year-old sister, named in the article as Hannah Bannock, had been killed on the steps of the family home on a Tuesday afternoon coming back from school. Charlotte sat back on her heels with the clipping in her lap and felt the whole picture come together at once. The boots, the door-facing habit, the hands on the revolver, the closed room at the end of the hall. The way Caleb had said on that first night in the kitchen that he had watched his brother turn into a ghost. The office door opened. Elijah was standing in the doorway, with a stack of feed ledgers in his arm and a question on his face that died the moment he saw what she was holding. The question was replaced by something terrible. Not anger. Anger she could have borne. What she saw in his fuss was the look of a man who has spent 3 years building a wall around a wound and has just watched a stranger walk through the wall as if it were not there. "Put it back," he said. His voice was almost gentle. That was the worst part. She put the clipping down. She set the silver coin on top of it. She did not look away from him. "Elijah, put the lid down, Miss Winslow, and do not ever open that chest again. Not for any reason. Not for anything. You were a Pinkerton. I was many things." He set the ledgers on the desk with great care as a man sets down something he is afraid he might break. "I am a rancher now. That is the only thing about me that need concern you. We will not speak of this again." She rose to her feet. She could feel her own heartbeat in her throat. "I am sorry. I had no right." "No, you did not." He looked at her then, and she saw with a small shock that his eyes were wet. He turned his face away before the wetness could become anything more. "Please, go downstairs. Help my brothers with the supper, and forget what you saw." She left the room. She closed the door softly behind her. She went down the narrow stairs with one hand on the wall to steady herself. And when she reached the bottom, she stood for a long moment with her back against the rough-cut wood and tried to make her breath come even. Caleb saw her face from the kitchen and started toward her, but she shook her head once and he stopped. He understood in the silent knowing that the youngest in a family always carries for the things no one says out loud. He went back to the stove. He did not ask. 3 days passed before Elijah spoke directly to her again. In those 3 days, the sky over Bannock Ridge changed. The first storm had passed, and a hard cold blue had settled over the valley, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak underfoot and froze the breath of the horses into white plumes. Charlotte, who had never owned a coat warmer than wool, was loaned an old buffalo robe by Caleb that swallowed her down to the ankles. She walked out to the corrals in it on the third morning to watch Jonah work a young chestnut gelding on a long line, and that was where she was standing with the buffalo robe wrapped around her and her cornflower blue eyes squinting into the white glare when the second sleigh of her life came up the mountain trail. It was a fine sleigh, too fine. The wood was lacquered black, the runners were polished brass, the horses were two matched grays of a quality no working ranch in the territory could afford. The driver wore livery. The man in the back seat wore a long charcoal coat of fine eastern wool, a beaver hat, and pale gray gloves that had clearly never touched a working tool in their life. He was perhaps 45 years old, slim and clean-shaven, with a face that looked friendly until you noticed the eyes did not match the smile. He stepped down from the sleigh as if he were stepping into a Philadelphia drawing room, and he extended a card to Elijah Bannock, who had come out of the barn to meet him with his hat pushed back and his hand resting easy on his belt. "Mr. Bannock, my name is Silas Grimshaw. I am here on behalf of the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad Company. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time and your brother's on a matter of mutual benefit." That was how the trouble walked in. They brought him into the main room. They sat him at the long plank table. Charlotte poured coffee from the iron pot on the stove and stood quietly at the end of the kitchen in the place a hired girl was meant to stand, and she watched the man Grimshaw with the same attention her father had once taught her to bring to a witness on a stand. Grimshaw spoke smoothly and at length. He spoke of progress. He spoke of the new spur line the railroad intended to push north out of Denver in the coming year. He spoke of the unfortunate fact that the surveyed route ran directly across the lower meadows of Bannock Ridge, and of the further unfortunate fact that the railroad would prefer not to invoke its rights of eminent domain when a friendly purchase could be arranged. He named a figure, $4,000. He named it as a man names a generous gift. Jonah's eyes lit up at the figure. Charlotte saw it. $4,000 was twice the value of the ranch on any honest day, and Jonah was a man who had been carrying the weight of 3 years of hard winters on his back, and $4,000 sounded to him like a door swinging open onto a warmer country. He started to speak. Elijah stopped him with the smallest motion of one finger. "We are not selling," Elijah said. Grimshaw smiled the smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Bannock, I beg you to consider. This land has been in your family for 3 years. I represent a company that has built 1,000 miles of rail across this continent. Surely we can come to an understanding. My father is buried in those lower meadows. We are not selling." The smile thinned but did not vanish. Grimshaw set a sheaf of papers on the table with a small, deliberate gesture. "Then perhaps you will simply read the offer at your leisure. I will be in Silver Pine for 2 weeks. Take the time, discuss it among yourselves." His pale eyes flicked just once toward the kitchen end of the room where Charlotte stood with the coffee pot. The look was the briefest possible thing. It was also unmistakable. It was the look of a man cataloging an unexpected face. "Everything in this world has a price, gentlemen. I am confident you will find yours." He gathered his beaver hat. He smiled once more at Elijah. He went out to his lacquered sleigh. The matched grays carried him back down the mountain road, and the room he left behind seemed colder than it had been before he came in. Jonah was on his feet before the door had stopped vibrating in its frame. $4,000, Eli. 4,000. We could buy twice this land down in the Texas Panhandle and still have money to start a herd that does not freeze to death every February. You cannot just say no for the both of us, for all 3 of us. I did. Pa is dead. Pa has been dead for 2 years. Pa is not here to make this decision, and you are not Pa. No, I am not. I am the oldest, and my answer is no. Caleb tried to mediate as the youngest always tries, and for a few minutes the three brothers were a knot of raised voices and old wounds in the middle of the long room. Charlotte set the coffee pot down very quietly. She crossed to the table. She picked up the sheaf of papers Silas Grimshaw had left behind. None of them noticed her. She carried the papers to the kitchen end of the table, sat down on a bench, pulled the oil lamp close, and began to read. She read as her father had taught her to read, which was to start with the signature page and work backward, because the lies in a contract were always written into the body, but the truth of who profited was always at the end. She found the signature line. She found the company seal. She found the witness clause and then noted with a small, particular attention of the trained eye that the witness's name had been printed, but the date beside it was already filled in. Already filled in. She frowned. A clean contract did not predate its own signing. She filed that away. She turned to the body of the document. Page 1 was boilerplate. Page 2 was boilerplate. Page 3 discussed the survey corridor. Page 4 discussed the cash payment, $4,000 upon execution. Page 5 and page 6 discussed boundaries. Page 7 discussed water rights. In the language there made her sit a little straighter, because the phrase perpetual easement had been slipped in where any honest man would have written limited use during construction. She filed that away too. Page 8, page 9, page 10. The brothers were still arguing 20 feet away. She could hear Jonah's voice rising and Elijah's staying very low and very flat, a man's voice going dangerous in the way it goes when he is more lethal than he is letting anyone see. She turned page 11, and there it was. It was buried in a paragraph of fine print near the bottom of the page, set in type half, a size smaller than the surrounding text, and written in the deliberately suffocating language that contract lawyers used when they wanted a clause to be technically present and practically invisible. The phrase she was looking for had been broken across 2 lines so it would not catch the eye, the quick reading. All mineral rights, both present and prospective, beneath the surface of the aforementioned property herein, conveyed in full and perpetual assignment to the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad Company. Charlotte read the sentence 3 times. Her father had taught her never to react until she had read a clause 3 times, because the first reading was for the words, and the second reading was for the meaning, and the third reading was for the man behind it. By the third reading, she knew exactly what she was looking at, and her hands had gone very cold around the edges of the paper. A railroad company did not pay twice the market value of a worthless mountain meadow because they wanted to lay track across it. A railroad company paid twice the market value because they had already sent a geologist up that meadow, and the geologist had come back smiling. There was something under Bannock Ridge: silver, gold, copper, coal. She did not know which. It did not matter which. What mattered was that Silas Grimshaw had walked into this house with a friendly smile and a fine sleigh and a contract designed to steal a fortune from 3 men who did not know they were sitting on it. She rose from the bench. The voices at the other end of the table fell silent as she moved into the lamplight, the contract held flat against her chest. 3 pairs of eyes turned towards her. The whiskey eyes, the amber eyes, the summer blue eyes. "Gentlemen," she said. Her voice came out quiet, but the room was listening. "You cannot sell, not to that man, not for any price he names. The contract he left on this table is a trap. He did not come up your mountain to buy your land, Mr. Bannock. He came up your mountain to steal it." Jonah laughed the short, sharp laugh of a man whose pride has just been pricked by a stranger. And what would a city girl in a navy dress know about a railroad contract? She turned the contract round so that the lamplight fell on page 11. She set it down on the table in front of Elijah Bannock. She placed one finger on the small, suffocating line of fine print near the bottom of the page. "Because my father was Edmund Winslow of Philadelphia," she said, "and he taught me to read a contract like this from the time I was 12 years old. And because every word of this clause was written by a man who knew exactly what was buried under your land and was betting that you did not." The room went very quiet. Elijah Bannock did not move for a long moment. Then slowly he leaned forward over the contract. His shadow fell across the page. His eyes followed her finger to the line of fine print, and she watched his face change as he read. It watched the slow tightening at the corners of his mouth, watched the long buried thing inside him come awake, as an old fire comes awake when a fresh log is laid on the coals. When he looked up at her at last, there was something new in his whiskey eyes. Not gratitude, not yet. Something earlier than gratitude. Something more like the look one fighter gives another across a ring when they realize for the first time that they are not alone. You read the whole thing. I read the whole thing. How long would it take you to walk us through it? All night. He nodded once slowly. He looked at his brothers. Caleb's eyes were wide. Jonah's mouth had gone shut in a hard line. Then put on a pot of coffee, Caleb, Elijah Bannock said. It is going to be a long evening. Outside the long log house at Bannock Ridge, the wind off the front range was beginning to rise again, and the second storm of the week was already sliding down out of the high passes, carrying snow heavier than the first. The pass at Silver Pine was sealing shut behind Charlotte Winslow with every passing hour. There would be no train south for many weeks now, perhaps not until the thaw, and 70 miles down the mountain in the candlelit back room of the Silver Pine Hotel, a man named Silas Grimshaw was bent over a telegram form writing in a careful hand a single line of instruction to a name no decent man in the territory cared to speak aloud. Deacon, bring 6 men and enough shells. Complication on the mountain. Ride. The night Charlotte Winslow read the contract aloud to the Bannock brothers became a turning point in the long log house, though none of them spoke of it that way at the time. They sat around the plank table until the candles burned down twice and Caleb had to fetch new ones from the pantry. Outside, the second storm came in over the ridge with a sound like a freight train passing in the dark, and the windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere out in the timber, a great pine cracked under the weight of wet snow and went down with a long, slow groan. Charlotte read each clause of the railroad contract with the patience her father had taught her, and she translated each one into plain English for the 3 men sitting around her. She explained the difference between a fee, simple, absolute, and a conditional grant, and she explained why the words perpetual easement on page 6 would have stripped them of the right to drink from their own creek by the second summer. She explained that the printed witness date had been pre-filled, which was the kind of error a careful clerk made when he was preparing many such contracts at once for many such victims. She explained that the $4,000 Silas Grimshaw had named was almost certainly less than 1/10 of what the mineral rights buried under their meadows were worth. And then she came last of all to the small thing that none of them had thought to mention. On the day Mr. Grimshaw came up here, she said quietly, Jonah, you took something from him. A small leather pouch. I saw him press it into your hand on the way out the door. What was in it? Jonah's face went the color of cold ash. He reached into the pocket of his work coat hanging on the hook by the door, and he drew out a small drawstring pouch of soft calf leather, and he set it on the table between them. The coins inside made a heavy musical sound when they settled. Charlotte loosened the drawstring with 2 fingers. 5 gold double eagles spilled out into the lamplight. $100 in solid United States gold. He said it was a token of good faith, Jonah said. His voice was thinner than she had ever heard it. He said it was nothing. He said it bound us to nothing. It binds you to everything. Charlotte did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In the eyes of any court in this territory, the moment you accepted that pouch, you accepted earnest money. Earnest money is the legal seal on a verbal agreement to sell. That man walked out of this house with your signature on his contract, whether you knew it or not. The $4,000 he offered after that was only the public price. The $100 in this pouch was the real one. Jonah closed his eyes. He did not curse. He did not slam his hand on the table as he had slammed it earlier in the evening. He simply put his face in his hands and sat very still, and Charlotte saw for the first time that beneath the fair-haired anger of the second brother, there lived a man who was capable of being ashamed. Elijah picked up the pouch. He weighed it once in his palm. Then he set it back down in the center of the table where all three of them could see it. It goes back to him, he said. Tomorrow if I can ride, the day after if I cannot, untouched. Witnessed by all three of us when it leaves this house. Are we agreed? We are agreed, Caleb said. Jonah lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red not from tears, but from something that had been about to be tears and had been beaten back into the deep place where Bannock men kept such things. We are agreed, he said. Charlotte rose then, because she understood that there was nothing more for her to say in that room, and that the three brothers needed to be alone with their decision, as three men need to be alone with the body of a friend. She gathered the contract, set it neatly in front of Elijah, and walked the length of the long room toward the staircase that led up to the small bedroom at the end of the hall. At the foot of the stairs, she paused with one hand on the rough-cut newel post and looked back. Elijah was watching her go. Their eyes met across the lamplight. He did not nod. He did not speak. But something passed between them that was older and quieter than any word he could have offered. And Charlotte carried that look with her up the dark stairs and into the small room that had once belonged to a girl named Hannah, and she lay down on the narrow bed in her clothes because she did not have the strength left to undress, and she stared up at the ceiling beams and listened to the storm and felt the world she had left behind in Philadelphia recede from her like a tide going out. In the morning, the snow had buried the lower fences to the rails, and the sun came up over the eastern ridge in a sky scrubbed clean and painfully blue. Charlotte rose before any of the brothers and built up the fire and put on coffee, and when Elijah came down the stairs in his shirt sleeves with his suspenders still hanging at his hips, he stopped on the bottom step and looked at her standing in the kitchen end of the long room as if he were seeing a thing he had not expected to see in his own house ever again. You did not have to, he said. I know. He poured himself a mug from the pot. He did not sit at the table. He stood by the stove and drank it slowly, and he looked at her over the rim of the mug for a long time before he spoke again. What you did last night, Miss Winslow. Reading that contract, catching the clauses, the pouch. I do not know how to thank you for it. I am not a man who has practiced thanking people. You do not have to practice. You only have to mean it. He almost smiled then. The corner of his mouth moved a quarter of an inch. It was, she would think later, the first true expression she had ever seen on his face. I mean it. That was the morning the work began. He brought down a cracked leather case from the high shelf in his office and laid it open on the long table after breakfast. Inside were hand-drawn maps of the Bannock Ridge holdings made by his father in the spring of 1876, the lines of the survey carefully inked in his father's slow, careful hand. Charlotte unrolled them one by one and weighted the corners with coffee mugs, and the two of them spent the morning bent over the maps in a pool of clean winter sunlight from the south window. She traced the survey line of the proposed railroad spur with her finger and showed him how it ran exactly through the heart of the lower meadows. And she showed him how, if a man wanted to mine those meadows, he would need precisely the corridor the railroad was claiming for its tracks. The corridor was not the prize. The corridor was the path to the prize. She also began that morning to teach him the language of his enemies. She wrote out for him the exact phrases that a fraudulent land agent would use, the stock words and the stock evasions, and she showed him how to recognize each one. She taught him how a contract could be made to lie, not by what it said, but by what it did not say. He listened to her with the close attention of a man relearning a tongue he had forgotten he once knew, and once or twice she caught him mouthing a phrase silently after her committing it to memory, and he in his turn began to teach her things. He taught her how to look at a man's hands when the man was speaking, because hands lied less often than mouths. He taught her how to listen to the gaps between sentences because the truth lived in the gaps. He taught her how to read a road for fresh tracks and how to count the riders in a party from the depth of a hoofprint in mud, and how to tell a man's height from the length of his stride. He taught her to walk a room and notice in the first 6 seconds where every door and window was, and which direction the doors open, and where she would go if she had to move quickly. He taught her these things slowly and carefully, as a man might teach his daughter to ride, and Charlotte received them as her father had once taught her to receive instruction from a master, which was without comment and with her whole mind awake. By the third evening of this strange new schooling, she had begun to understand who Elijah Bannock had once been. By the fifth evening, she had begun to understand the cost of his having stopped being that man. The cattle were found on the morning of the eighth day. Jonah came in through the front door at a dead run, snow-blown halfway up to his knees, his face the color of bleached bone. He did not bother to close the door behind him. He grabbed his rifle from the rack by the entrance and his hat from the peg, and he turned to the room and said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, "The Hereford herd, down at the North Creek, dead, all of them." They saddled in 5 minutes. Charlotte rode the bay mare she had ridden up the mountain on her first night, and she did not protest when Elijah simply looked at her and nodded once, the nod meaning, "Come along, you are part of this now." The North Creek lay in a long fold of land where the timber pulled back from the water and the bunch grass grew thick in the summer. In November, it should have been a quiet, white place where the cattle came down to break the ice and drink. Instead, it was something out of an Old Testament dream. 14 of the big red and white Hereford cows lay scattered along the bank of the creek in the postures of sudden death. Their heads were thrown back, their tongues were swollen and dark in their mouths. Foam had dried in white crusts on their muzzles and stained the snow around them. The youngest of the dead was a heifer Caleb had bottle raised the spring before. Caleb saw her and made a sound like a thing inside him breaking. He went to his knees beside her in the snow and put one gloved hand on her stiff flank, and he did not get up for a long time. Elijah walked the length of the bank slowly. He did not look at the cattle. He looked at the snow around them, in the snow above the waterline, in the smooth, flat ice along the edge of the creek. He stopped once and bent down and lifted something out of a willow tangle near the water, and when he straightened, he was holding a torn square of burlap sacking. He brought it to his face. He smelled it. His expression did not change, but Charlotte saw the thing inside his eyes go very still and very cold. "Strychnine," he said. "Someone walked up the creek above the herd in the night and emptied a sack of it into the water at the bend." Jonah swore and started for his horse. Elijah caught his sleeve. "Where are you going?" "Where do you think I am going?" "I am going down to Silver Pine, and I am going to drag Silas Grimshaw out of that hotel by his collar, and I am going to find out what he knows, and then I am going to kill him." "You are not. You will get yourself hanged for nothing." "Nothing." Jonah turned on his older brother in the snow with a fury Charlotte had not yet seen. 14 head, Elijah. 14 head of Hereford in one night. That is half a year of feed. That is the difference between making it through the spring and selling out at any price the railroad cares to name. That is not nothing. I know what it is. Then ride down there with me, you and me, right now. And do what? Tell me, Jonah. You walk into the Silver Pine Hotel and you accuse Silas Grimshaw of poisoning your cattle in front of every drunk and timberman in the barroom. He laughs at you. He calls his lawyer. The county sheriff had been in his pocket. We have no witnesses. We have no track in the snow worth following because the storm is going to bury what is left of it before sunset. We have a torn sack of burlap that could have come from any feed store in the territory. We have nothing that a court would call evidence. And you and I would ride home with our anger spent, and nothing changed except that the next time he comes for us, he comes ready. Since when have you been a coward? The word hung in the white air between them. Elijah did not move. Charlotte saw a flicker of something pass across his face that was older and worse than anger. Then he turned without answering, walked back to his horse, mounted in one slow movement, and rode for the house. He did not speak to anyone for the rest of the day. He nailed himself into the small upstairs office and did not come down for supper. Caleb sat at the table picking at his food, and Jonah sat with his back to the fire and stared at the floor between his boots, and Charlotte ate 2 bites of stew and put down her spoon. That night she did not climb the stairs to knock on his door. She had learned enough about Elijah Bannock by then to know that a knock would only push him further into the locked place where he had been hiding for 3 years. So she did the thing she had always done in Philadelphia when her father was tangled in a difficult case and his pride would not let him ask for help. She sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh sheet of foolscap and a quill and the small bottle of India ink she had carried in her valise, and she began to work. She wrote at the top of the page the name Silas Grimshaw. Below it, she wrote Transcontinental Pacific Railroad. Below that, she began a list. Who profits if Bannock Ridge changes hands? Who has been seen with Grimshaw in Silver Pine? Who works for Grimshaw? How many other ranches in this valley have been sold to the same company in the past 2 years? How many of those sales were voluntary? Where does Grimshaw bank? Where does he sleep? Where does he take his meals? What does he drink? Whom does he write to? She did not have answers to any of these questions, but she wrote them all down in a neat column as her father had taught her to lay out a case before she ever went looking for the first witness. By the time the candle burned down to its last inch, she had filled 3 pages of foolscap with questions and possible lines of inquiry and small notes in the margins about the tells she had already begun to recognize on Grimshaw's face when she had served him coffee on the day he came up the mountain. The way his eyes had moved across the bookshelves, how he had not asked where the brother's father was buried, even though he had spoken of the lower meadows. The slight shift in his voice when he had named the figure of $4,000, as if he were embarrassed by how small it sounded to his own ear. She blew out the candle and went up to her room in the dark. She did not sleep much. In the morning, she set the 3 sheets of foolscap on the long table at the place where Elijah usually took his breakfast. She put a stone on top of them so they would not blow when the door opened. She poured coffee. She turned to the stove and began to fry bacon, and she did not look at the door when his boots came down the stairs. She heard him stop at the table. She heard the small, dry sound of paper being lifted. She heard a long silence. "You did this last night." "I did. All by yourself." "Most of it. The rest was waiting in my head from before." He came around the end of the table and stood at her elbow at the stove. He was close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the cold morning air. She did not turn. Charlotte. It was the first time he had used her given name. "I cannot be a Pinkerton again. I will not put my hand on a badge for the rest of my life. Do you understand that? I am not asking you to be a Pinkerton. I am asking you to teach me to be one. This is my fight too now. I read his contract, and I know what he is, and I cannot pretend I do not know. I need you to show me how to do the work. The rest I will do myself." He was quiet for a long time. The bacon hissed in the pan. The wind moved against the south window with a soft, persistent sound. "All right," he said at last. "I will teach you. God help us both." That was how the second part of their long winter began. For the next 2 weeks, the upstairs office of the long log house became a small command room. Elijah brought down every paper he had on the surrounding country, old county registers, brand books, lists of homestead patents he had collected without quite knowing why during the 3 years he had been on the ridge. Charlotte added to these the careful, structured notes she had been keeping since the night of the contract reading, and the two of them began to map the network of land transfers that had moved through Silver Pine Valley in the past 24 months. The picture that emerged was ugly and clear. 11 small ranches in the valley had changed hands in the past year. 8 of those 11 had gone to a Denver holding company called Rocky Mountain Surety. Rocky Mountain Surety had then assigned its interest in every case to a second corporation called Western Mineral Holdings. Western Mineral Holdings had then assigned its interest in every case to the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad. The chain was clean. The chain was deliberate. The chain had been designed to make any single sale look like an honest market transaction, while the larger patterns stayed invisible. Charlotte showed him the chain on the morning of the 10th day, drawn out in her own neat hand on a long sheet of brown butcher paper she had spread across the office floor. He stood over it for a full minute without speaking. Then he crouched on his heels beside her and put one finger on the name Western Mineral Holdings, and in a quiet voice he said, "I have heard that name before. In Chicago. Years ago. There was a file on my desk one week. I never had time to open it. Now you wish you had. Now I wish I had." He looked at her sideways, then with his face very close to hers in the cold morning light from the office window, and she saw that he was about to say something he had not said in 3 years. She saw it begin to form behind his eyes. And then she saw him decide, with the small, hard discipline of a man who has built his life around such decisions, that he would not say it. Not yet. Not this morning. There was too much work to be done first. He stood up. He walked to the window. He cleared his throat once. "We will need to know who Grimshaw is meeting with in town. I cannot ride into Silver Pine without giving the game away. He knows my face by now. But Caleb is unknown to him, and Caleb has reason to go down the mountain for the nails and lamp oil and feed corn anyway. I will send him in tomorrow with a list of names to watch for and a memory train to bring back faces." That was the plan. It did not survive the next sundown. The fire began in the barn a little after 11 o'clock at night. Charlotte was reading by candlelight in the small room at the end of the hall when she heard the first scream of a horse. The sound a horse makes when it knows it is going to die in a closed space is unlike any other sound on earth. She had never heard it before. She knew what it was the instant it reached her. She was on her feet before she had decided to be on her feet, and she was at the window. And what she saw outside the window stopped her heart for a full second. The barn was a tower of orange light against the black timber. Flames were already eating out of the high loft window where the hay was stored, and a long, thick column of smoke was climbing into the cold winter sky and bending toward the ridge where the wind took it. She could hear the horses screaming inside all of them. 3 horses and the mule in the new bay foal Caleb had been bottle feeding since October. She ran. She ran in her stocking feet down the dark hall and down the dark stairs and through the main room, and she was reaching the front door at the same instant that Caleb was reaching it from the kitchen end, with a bucket in each hand and a wild, high look on his face. "My horses." That was all he said. He was through the door before anyone could stop him. Elijah came out of his bedroom on the ground floor, still pulling on a coat, and Jonah came thundering down the stairs from the loft above the kitchen, with his rifle in one hand and a coil of rope in the other, and the 3 of them were across the snow toward the barn before Charlotte had her own coat off the hook. She came up behind them at the barn door. The heat hit her like a moving wall. She could see Caleb already inside the wide doorway, a dark figure against the orange of the flames, leading the first of the panicked horses out by a rope wrapped around its halter. Elijah took the rope from him and ran the horse out into the yard, and Caleb went back in for the next one, and Jonah was already moving along the side of the barn, cutting the leather of the half door so the foal could be passed out through it. Charlotte stood at the doorway and caught the horses as Elijah and Caleb brought them out one by one and led them to the safety of the corral. The 3rd horse came out screaming with its mane on fire. She beat the flames out with her bare hands in her own shawl and did not notice until later that her palms were burned. The mule came out with Jonah pulling on its halter and Caleb pushing on its rump, and a string of curses flying between the 2 of them that would have shamed a riverboat man. The foal came out last in Caleb's arms, the boy half running with the small, heavy weight of the colt cradled against his chest. It was as he cleared the doorway that the loft beam came down. She heard the crack of it before she saw it, a sound like a rifle shot, and then the long groaning shift of timber giving way under flame. She screamed Caleb's name. He was already lunging forward with the foal in his arms, and the beam came down behind him in a shower of sparks and burning shingles, and one of the burning fragments, a long piece of pine timber the length of a man's forearm, struck him across the right shoulder and the right upper arm as he ran. He pitched forward into the snow, with the foal still wrapped against his chest, and he did not get up. Elijah reached him first. He pulled the burning fragment off Caleb's shoulder with his bare hand, threw it aside into the snow where it hissed, and went dark and turned the boy over. Caleb's face was white, his eyes were open, his right arm was bent at an angle that should not have been possible. "I have him," Elijah said. "Charlotte, the kitchen, hot water and clean cloth, now." She ran without thinking. She was in the kitchen by the time she remembered her burned hands, and she did not care. She threw 2 pots onto the stove and dragged the bandage box down from the high shelf where she had seen Caleb put it on her second day in the house, and she had the fire stoked, roaring high under both pots by the time Elijah came through the door with his youngest brother in his arms. She would think later that the next 4 hours of her life were the hours that made her into the woman she had been pretending to be ever since she stepped off the train at Silver Pine. She set Caleb's broken arm under Elijah's quiet instruction, the two of them working together over the long kitchen table, the boy biting down on a folded leather strap and not crying out even when the bones went back into place. She cleaned the long burn on his shoulder with hot water and lye soap, and she packed it with the pine pitch ointment Caleb himself had taught her how to make 10 days earlier. And she wrapped his shoulder and his arm together in clean linen, torn from one of her own petticoats. Through all of it, Caleb watched her face and tried to smile up at her when the pain led him. And once, when she was leaning over him to tie a knot at his collarbone, he reached up with his good left hand and caught her wrist and held it for a moment. "You did not run," he said. His voice was thin. "When the beam came down, you did not run. I am here, Caleb. Do not go back to Philadelphia, please." She did not answer him. She did not trust herself to answer him. She finished the knot and smoothed the linen and bent and kissed him on the forehead as a sister would kiss a brother. Jonah was the one who walked the perimeter of the burned barn at first light. He found what he was looking for in a tangle of brush on the windward side where someone had crouched in the snow long enough to leave the imprint of a knee in the burnt remains of a small kerosene lantern. Beside the lantern, half buried in the disturbed snow, was a torn scrap of dark oilskin. The scrap was the size of a man's palm. It had been ripped from the lining of a coat and worked into the leather lining in dark thread in the manner some men mark their gear so as never to lose it. Was a small 5-pointed star in the single word deacon. Jonah brought the scrap into the kitchen and laid it on the table next to where Elijah was sitting with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him. Elijah looked at the scrap for a long time. He did not pick it up. His face went through the slow change that Charlotte had seen once before when he had read the mineral rights clause on page 11 of the railroad contract. The slow tightening at the corners of the mouth, the slow waking of the long buried thing. "Deacon Meredith," he said quietly. "You know him. I know of him. Every man in my old line of work knows of him. He is the worst kind of hired gun there is in the Western Territories. He came up out of Texas after the war. He works for whoever pays him, and he leaves nothing alive that he is paid to kill. If Grimshaw has sent for Deacon Meredith, then Grimshaw is finished playing the businessman. Then we are out of time. We are out of time." Charlotte was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with her burned hands wrapped in linen, listening. She stepped into the room and crossed to the table and put her bandaged hand flat on the scrap of oilskin between the brothers. "Then we move faster," she said. "Both of us. Together." Elijah looked up at her. The room around them seemed to fall away. The low fire in the stove, the gray pre-dawn at the window, the faint sound of Caleb breathing in the next room where they had carried him to rest. None of it was in the look that passed between them. Only the look itself and the long, quiet acknowledgement that the line they had been pretending not to cross had been crossed for them by other men with darker intentions. He stood up from the table. He walked around to where she was standing. He did not take her in his arms. He did not even take her hand. What he did was lean forward very slowly and rest his forehead against hers. And he closed his eyes, and the two of them stood that way in the dim kitchen, for what felt like a long time, neither speaking. She could feel the rough warmth of his temple against her own. She could feel the slow, steady drum of his pulse in the place where his jaw met his throat. She could feel everything in him that he had been holding back for 3 years, pressing against the inside of his skin and wanting out. "Go to bed, Charlotte," he said at last, the words barely a breath. "We have work in the morning." She went. The next 4 days passed in a kind of fever. Caleb began to mend slowly, his fever breaking on the second night. Charlotte changed his bandages morning and evening and read aloud to him from a battered copy of The Adventures of David Crockett that she found on the parlor shelf, and Caleb listened with the soft half-smile of a boy who had not been read to aloud since his mother died. Jonah kept a Winchester within arm's reach at all times, even when he was eating, and walked the perimeter of the buildings at sunrise and sundown with a slow, careful step. Elijah and Charlotte worked through the days and into the nights at the long table, refining the case against Grimshaw, drafting in Charlotte's clean, lawyerly hand a long letter that would need to be carried somewhere and used somehow when the time came. It was on the morning of the 5th day after the fire that Silas Grimshaw came back up the mountain. He did not come alone this time. The lookout on the ridge above the lower meadows was a half-grown shepherd dog named Pilot that Caleb had raised, and Pilot began to bark a little after 10 o'clock, with the particular high, sharp bark he reserved for many strangers at once. Charlotte was at the kitchen window with a dish towel in her hand. She saw them come up the long, open road from the south. There were 8 riders. Grimshaw was at the head of the column on a tall gray horse, and behind him, in a loose, easy formation, came 7 men in long oilcloth coats. The man riding closest to Grimshaw was tall and lean, and rode with the loose, hipped grace of a man who had been on a horse since he was 4 years old. He wore 2 pistols crossed at his belt, and his eyes from across the snow looked the color of dirty ice. She did not need anyone to tell her his name. The 8 riders stopped at the lower gate of the home pasture 100 yards from the front door of the house. Grimshaw rode forward alone the last 50 yards. He was holding a fresh sheaf of papers in his right hand, and his face wore the patient, faintly amused expression of a man who has come to deliver bad news and is enjoying it. Elijah went out onto the porch. He did not carry a rifle. He carried only a tin cup of coffee, which he set down on the railing as he stepped to the edge of the boards. Behind him in the open doorway stood Jonah with the Winchester, and beyond Jonah at the kitchen window stood Charlotte with her bandaged hands flat against the cold glass. Grimshaw drew rein 20 feet from the porch. "Mr. Bannock, good morning to you." "Mr. Grimshaw, I am sorry to disturb your peace at this hour. I have new information that I think changes the conversation we had 2 weeks ago." He held up the sheaf of papers. "It seems your father, the late Josiah Bannock, took a loan from my company in the September of 1876, $3,500, secured against the deed to this entire property. The note came due 3 months ago. No payment has been received. Under the laws of the territory of Colorado, my company has the right to commence foreclosure proceedings, and I am here to begin them. You and your brothers will vacate this land within 7 days, or my associates here will assist you in doing so." Elijah did not move. His face did not change. "My father never borrowed $1 from any man in his life. I have his signature here on the note, witnessed and dated. The county recorder has a duplicate filed in Silver Pine. Everything is in order, Mr. Bannock. Everything is in perfect order. I am sorry." He did not sound sorry. He turned his horse and rode the 50 yards back to where the 7 gunmen waited. The lean, tall one with the dirty ice eyes lingered a moment longer than the rest. He walked his horse 3 steps closer to the porch. He looked up at Elijah Bannock with a long, flat look of professional curiosity, one craftsman appraising the work of another. "7 days, Bannock," he said. His voice was as soft as new flannel. "Do not make this hard for me." Then he wheeled the horse and rode away after the others, and the 8 of them disappeared in single file down the long road into the south timber. Charlotte was already moving by the time Elijah came back inside. She had the sheaf of papers off the porch railing where Grimshaw had set them, and she was at the long table with the lamp pulled close. Elijah came to stand at her shoulder. Jonah stood behind them both with the Winchester now resting in the crook of his arm. "It is forged," she said. She was reading even as she spoke. "It must be forged. Your father did not borrow that money." "How do we prove a thing like that? The signature is going to look like his signature. They will have copied it from a real document. They will have a witness in their pocket and a county clerk on their payroll. We are out here and they are the railroad." "Caleb." She turned. Caleb was standing in the doorway from the parlor, his right arm in the sling she had made him, his face still pale but alert. "Caleb, I need you to think very carefully. The night after I had been here a week when you were sitting up with me by the fire, you told me a story about your father. You told me what happened to him in the summer of 1876. Tell it to me again. Right now, every detail you can remember." Caleb blinked. Then he understood. She watched the understanding light up his face. "He had a stroke," he said, "in July of 1876, the first week of July. He went out one morning to mend a fence in the home pasture, and Jonah found him an hour later face down in the grass beside the fence wire. He could not speak. The whole right side of his body was gone. He could not hold a fork to feed himself. He could not write his own name. Dr. Halloran came up from Silver Pine and told us he might live a month and might live a year, and not to expect anything more than that. He never spoke another clear word for the rest of his life. He died in the November of that year, 4 months after the stroke." Charlotte put her finger on the date at the top of the loan note in front of her. "This document," she said, "is dated the 14th of September, 1876. 2 months and 1 week after Josiah Bannock had a stroke that took the use of his right side and his ability to write. He could not have signed this paper. There is not a court in this country that would accept this signature if we put a doctor on the stand to swear to the date of the stroke, not even a corrupt one. This paper is the rope they have hung themselves with." The room went very quiet. Then Elijah Bannock began to laugh. It was the first time Charlotte had heard him laugh. It was a low, rough sound, almost a cough, and it was not entirely a laugh of joy. It was the laugh of a man who has spent 3 years believing that he has lost forever the only weapon he was ever any good at using, and has just discovered that the weapon was sitting in a desk drawer the whole time. He turned to her in the lamplight. The whiskey eyes were lit from inside. "Charlotte, listen to me. There is one man in this territory who can take a piece of evidence like this and turn it into a federal indictment in a week. His name is Augustus Whitaker. He is the United States Marshal for the Denver District. He worked one case against the railroads in Wyoming 6 years ago when I was still with the agency. He is the only honest badge between here and Cheyenne, and he hates what the rail companies are doing to the small homesteaders worse than I do. If we can get word to him, if we can get a telegram out of Silver Pine before Grimshaw realizes what we have, if we can put Augustus Whitaker on the road to this ridge before that 7th day, I will go." He turned on her so fast it was almost violent. "No, absolutely not. The man who burned this barn is camped somewhere in the south. Timber right now with 7 hired guns. You are not riding down that mountain alone. I am the only one who can. You and Jonah are known to Grimshaw by sight. Caleb cannot ride with that arm. I am a woman in a navy dress with a story about needing to send a wire to my aunt in Boston. I will not be stopped at the Silver Pine Telegraph office. You will be." He stared at her. She watched him fight it. She watched him lose. "I do not like this. I do not need you to like it. I need you to trust me." He closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them. "All right, Charlotte, go. Tomorrow at first light. Take the bay mare. Do not stop in town for anything but the wire. Do not speak to anyone you do not have to speak to. And be back by sundown, or I am riding down that mountain after you with Jonah at my back. Do you understand?" "I understand." She rode out at dawn. The morning was gray and cold, and the snow on the trail was packed hard from the riders who had come up the day before. The bay mare moved well, careful and willing, picking her way down the long switchbacks under Charlotte's hands. Charlotte rode wrapped in the buffalo robe Caleb had given her, with Jonah's spare belt knife in her boot, and her father's small folding penknife in the lining of her glove, and a folded sheet of paper in the inside pocket of her dress containing the exact text of the telegram she meant to send. The text had been worked out with Elijah at the long table the night before in a code based on contract law phrases that Augustus Whitaker would recognize at once, and no other reader in the Silver Pine Telegraph office would be able to decipher. She reached town a little after noon. She tied the mare at the rail outside the telegraph office. She walked in with her chin lifted and her cornflower blue eyes calm, and she told the operator that she needed to send a wire to her family in Denver. She paid in coin from her own purse. She did not look at the door once while the operator tapped the keys, but she felt the back of her neck the whole time, and she did not breathe entirely freely until the operator handed her the receipt and said the message had gone through. She walked out of the telegraph office and turned not toward her horse, but toward a low building 2 doors down with a wooden sign over the door reading Silver Pine County Land Office. The clerk inside was an old man named Timothy Grundy, with a wisp of white hair and steel-rimmed spectacles, and the careful, suspicious eyes of a man who had spent 40 years guarding files he half suspected someone would eventually try to steal. He looked at her over the top of the spectacles as she came in. "Mr. Grundy, my name is Charlotte Winslow. I would like to see the registered copy of a loan note filed by the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad against the Bannock property in the September of 1876. I am willing to pay the standard examination fee." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked toward the front window of the office in the way an old clerk checks whether anyone is watching. "Standard examination fee is $1, miss." She set a $10 gold piece on the counter. He looked at the gold piece. Then he looked at her face. Then he looked back at the gold piece. Then very slowly he turned and walked to the long row of file cabinets at the back of the office and opened a drawer marked Liens and Loans 1876, and he drew out a thin manila folder and brought it to the counter and laid it in front of her without a word. She opened it. The original loan note lay on top, the same wording as the copy Grimshaw had brought up the mountain, the same forged signature of Josiah Bannock at the bottom, the same printed date of the 14th of September. She took out a small leather pocketbook and began to copy the document by hand, line for line, as her father had taught her to make a clean record of evidence in a public archive without removing the original. It was as she was copying the witness clause at the bottom of the second page that she stopped. She read the clause again. She read it a third time with her father's voice in her head. The witness signature at the bottom of the page belonged to Silas Grimshaw himself. Beside the signature, in the small space provided for the date of the witnessing, was written in a careful clerical hand, the date the 12th of September, 1876. The 12th of September, 2 days before the date of the document, the witness was certifying that he had witnessed. Charlotte sat very still on the high stool at the counter of the Silver Pine Land Office. A clock somewhere on the wall behind her ticked once, then again. Outside on the boardwalk, a wagon went by, and a man called out a greeting to another man, and the small ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon in a frontier town went on without the smallest regard for the fact that a young woman in a navy dress had just found in the witness line of a forged contract the single mistake that would hang Silas Grimshaw and save the lives of 3 brothers on a ridge 10 miles north. She closed the folder. She slid the gold piece across the counter to old Timothy Grundy. She slipped her copybook back into the inside pocket of her dress, along with the original folder, which she did not return to him. And the look she gave him was the calm, direct look of a woman who had decided something and was inviting him to decide whether he wanted to be the kind of man who stood in her way. Grundy looked at the gold piece. He looked at his own hands, which were old and trembling slightly. He looked at the empty space on the counter where the folder had been a moment ago. Then he reached out very slowly and slid the gold piece into his vest pocket, and he turned his back on her and walked to the front window of the office and stood there looking out at the street and he did not turn around again until she had gone. She rode back up the mountain with the folded folder pressed flat against her rib under the buffalo robe and the wind in her face, and the bay mare moving steady and willing under her, in the white peaks of the front range, rising ahead of her into a sky that was beginning to bleed orange at the edges. She came up the last switchback as the first stars were showing in the eastern sky. Elijah was waiting on the porch. He had been waiting, she would learn later, since 2 hours after she had ridden out at dawn. He came down the steps as soon as he saw her on the trail, and he caught the bay mare by the bridle and helped her down with both hands at her waist. And when she was on her feet on the snowy ground in front of him, she looked up at him in the last of the daylight and said only 4 words. "I have him, Elijah." He looked at her for a long moment in the orange light. The mountain wind moved a strand of honey-colored hair across her cheek. Her cornflower blue eyes were burning with something he had not seen in any woman's face in his entire life. He understood with a clarity that hit him almost like a physical blow that he had loved her since the night she had walked into his kitchen with the railroad contract in her hands and said to him, "Gentlemen, you cannot sell." He had loved her every day since. He would love her, he understood now, for the rest of whatever days remained to him in this world. He did not say any of that. There would be a time for saying it. This was not the time. What he said was, "Come inside. Show me." And he took her bandaged hand in his own and led her up the steps of the long log house at Bannock Ridge, and the door closed behind them on the cold winter night. And somewhere very far down the mountain, at the southern edge of the timber, in a camp pitched out of sight of any honest road, a tall, lean man with eyes the color of dirty ice was cleaning a pair of pistols by firelight and counting down the days remaining on the deadline he had given to the Bannock brothers. 5 days remained. The 5 days that followed Charlotte's ride to Silver Pine were not days of waiting. They were days of a different kind of work, the kind of work three brothers had not done together in many years, and the kind of work a young woman from Philadelphia had never imagined doing in any life she had once been able to picture for herself. On the morning after she returned from the land office, Elijah Bannock went up the narrow stairs to the small office on the second floor and unlocked the black walnut chest under his desk for the first time since he had buried it there in the autumn of 1875. He brought down what was inside the chest in his own arm and laid the contents out on the long plank table in the main room. There was the Pinkerton coin in the Chicago Tribune clipping, which Charlotte had already seen. There was a folded leather wallet that had once held a badge, the leather still shaped to the absent metal. There was a small daguerreotype of a girl with light hair and serious eyes framed in tarnished silver. And under all of those things, wrapped in heavy oilcloth, tied at both ends with rawhide cord, were the tools. He untied the cord. He opened the oilcloth, and he laid out on the bare wood of the table side by side in the cold morning light 2 Colt Peacemaker revolvers with 7.5-inch barrels blued so deep they looked black, the walnut grips worn smooth by the shape of one particular hand. Beside the Colts, he laid a Winchester model 1873 carbine, the receiver case hardened in colors of bronze and slate, the stock as well kept as an heirloom violin. Beside the Winchester, he laid a small leather pouch heavy with brass cartridges and a tin of gun oil and 3 cleaning rods of different lengths and a folded chamois cloth gone soft as felt with use. Charlotte stood at the kitchen end of the room with a dish towel in her hands and watched him lay each thing out. He moved with a slow, methodical care that was almost a kind of prayer. She understood in the watching that she was seeing a man pick up a weight he had set down on the worst day of his life and had sworn he would never lift again. She understood that she had asked him to lift it. She understood that he had agreed. He looked up at her once across the table. The look was steady. There was no blame in it, and there was no regret. There was only the small, clear acknowledgement of 2 people who had decided to stand on the same patch of ground and take whatever came at them across it. "I have not fired a man's weapon at a man in 3 years and 7 months," he said quietly. "I had hoped never to do it again. I want you to know that I am not doing it now because I want to. I am doing it because there are men coming up this mountain who mean to take everything we have. And the law that should protect us is too far away to arrive on its own. I know, she said. I know that. Good. He picked up one of the Colts and broke it open and turned it slowly in his hands, feeling the action, listening to the small, dry click of the cylinder. Then we will get to work. Jonah came down from the loft with his own rifle and a Henry repeater that had belonged to their father, and he laid them out at the other end of the table. He brought down the two 10-gauge shotguns from the rack by the back door. He brought down a Sharps Big 50 Buffalo rifle from a hook in the rafters that Charlotte had not even noticed in all her weeks in the house, a long, heavy weapon that looked as if it had been built to bring down something larger than a man. He laid these things out and began to clean them one by one, and Caleb, with his right arm still in a sling, sat at the table opposite him and counted out brass cartridges into neat piles by caliber. Caleb did this work left-handed and slowly, but he did it without complaint, and once when Charlotte passed behind him with a fresh pot of coffee, she paused and laid her free hand for a moment on the top of his head, as a sister would, and Caleb closed his eyes and leaned back into the touch and did not say anything. That was how the war room began. For the next 4 days, the long log house at Bannock Ridge became a small fortress. Elijah and Jonah cut new firing slits in the heavy log walls of the main room at the angles that gave the best lines of sight onto the open ground in front of the house. And they shuttered the slits with hinged squares of heavy timber so that no light would show from the road at night. They moved the kitchen table into the center of the room and piled it with cartridges in neat rows, and they ran a length of wire from the front porch out across the home pasture and through a clever loop tied to the door of the woodshed so that any horse coming up the road in the dark would set the wire jumping and the door of the shed banging like a warning bell. Charlotte, who had never thought of herself as a person who would handle a weapon, allowed Jonah to teach her how to load a shotgun. He taught her in the cold morning sunlight on the back porch, with his face very serious and his voice patient in a manner she had not known him capable of, and when she set the loaded gun down and turned to him, she saw that the second brother had finally accepted her as something more than a guest in his house. He nodded once at her. That was all. It was enough. On the second of the 5 days, Elijah took her out behind the woodshed and put one of the Colt peacemakers into her bandaged hands, and he showed her how to hold it and how to brace her wrist against the recoil and how to point a handgun at a target as you would point your finger. He did not have her fire it. He told her she would not need to fire it, that the Colt was for her hand only as a last refusal, the kind of last refusal a woman should have available to her when men with hard intentions came up onto her porch. She closed her bandaged hand around the worn walnut grip and felt the weight of the weapon, and she did not flinch from it. I will not fire it unless I have no other choice, she said. That is the only reason any decent person ever fires one, he said. Keep it in the pocket of that buffalo robe. Do not let it out of your reach. On the third day, Charlotte went into the small bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall, the room that had once belonged to Hannah, and she sat down at the small writing desk by the window and began to draft what she thought of in her own mind as the indictment. It was not a legal document in any formal sense. It was a single long page of clean, clear English written in her best hand that laid out point by point the case against Silas Grimshaw and the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad. The forged loan note dated 2 months after Josiah Bannock's stroke. The predated witness signature of the 12th of September against the document date of the 14th. The chain of shell companies running from Rocky Mountain Surety through Western Mineral Holdings to the railroad. The poisoning of the Hereford herd, the burning of the barn, the torn scrap of oilcloth bearing the mark of Deacon Meredith, the $100 in earnest money pressed into Jonah's unwilling hand. The mineral rights clause hidden in fine print on page 11. She wrote each item in its own paragraph, and at the bottom of the page, she wrote a single sentence in larger letters. These acts constitute federal crimes of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy under the laws of the United States, and they are presented here for the attention of United States Marshal Augustus Whitaker of the Denver District. She read the page through once. Then she folded it 3 times and slipped it into the inside pocket of her dress, where it would lie flat against her ribs. On the fourth day, the snow held off, and the air was sharp and so clear that the peaks of the Front Range looked close enough to touch from the front porch of the house. Caleb walked out into the home pasture in the late afternoon to feed the horses, his good arm doing the work of two, and Charlotte walked beside him to help. They worked in a comfortable silence for some minutes. And then Caleb stopped and leaned his good shoulder against the corral rail and looked at her sideways with the small, shy smile she had come to know. "Charlotte, yes, if we live through what is coming, will you stay?" She did not answer at once. She looked out across the home pasture to the long blue shadow of the mountain falling across the snow, and she thought of Philadelphia and the house on Rittenhouse Square and the brass plate on her father's office door and the small wooden box of her mother's savings that had paid for her train ticket west, and she thought of the 8 days of riding in the sealed cars and the night she had stepped off the platform at Silver Pine into a world she could not have imagined. "I will stay," she said. "Tell your brother that for me if you have a chance, and I do not. I think he would rather hear it from your mouth." "I think so too." He smiled then, the soft summer blue eyes warming, and they finished feeding the horses and walked back to the house together in the slanting orange light. That night, the fourth night of the five, Elijah Bannock and Charlotte Winslow sat alone at the long plank table after Caleb and Jonah had gone up to bed. The fire was low and red in the great stone fireplace. The oil lamp between them threw their two shadows long against the back wall of the main room. The wind outside had died down to almost nothing. There was no sound in the world, except the small crack of a log shifting in the embers and the slow, steady tick of the brass clock on the mantel. He had been silent for a long time. She did not push him. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean across the table to catch it. "I have not said this aloud to another person in 3 years and 7 months." She waited. "On the night I came home from Wyoming after I finished the work I had gone there to finish, I sat in a hotel room in Cheyenne with my badge on the table in front of me, and I made a promise to my dead sister and to myself. I promised that I would never again pick up a weapon for the cause of justice. I had used the cause of justice to chase a man across 2 territories, and I had caught him, and I had stood over him with my Colt in my hand, and I had done what the law said I could not do, but my heart said I had to. And in the doing of it, I had become the thing I had spent my whole working life trying to put a stop to. I had become a man who killed because he had decided someone deserved it. Hannah did not come back to life. Nothing in this world came back to life. The only thing that changed was that I had to live in the same skin with the man I had become." His hands were folded on the table in front of him. They were very still. She did not reach for them. "I came up onto this mountain to disappear. I brought my brothers because they would not let me come alone. I told myself I would learn to live as a small thing, a man with a herd, a man with a barn, a man with no opinions and no weapons and no fight in him. I told myself the silence would be a kind of peace, and for a while it was. For a while on this ridge with the snow and the timber and the work, I almost believed I had found my way to a small, clean second life that did not require me to be the man I had been before." He looked up at her then. The whiskey eyes in the lamplight were not the cold eyes of the man at the train station. They were the eyes of a man who had carried a weight alone for too long and was for the first time thinking about the possibility of setting it down. And then a woman in a navy blue dress walked through that door with a railroad contract under her arm, and she sat down at this table and she read the contract aloud page by page, and on page 11 she put her finger on a line of fine print, and she looked up at me with cornflower blue eyes and she said, "Gentlemen, you cannot sell." And in that moment, I felt something inside my chest that I had not felt since the day Hannah went out the door of our mother's house in Chicago for the last time. I felt that I was not alone. I felt that there was another mind in the world that worked as mine had once worked, and that the mind belonged to a person who was sitting 6 feet away from me, and that I had not invited her there, and that she had come anyway. He stopped. He drew a slow breath. "Charlotte, Whatever happens at sundown tomorrow on the lower Meadow Road, I want you to know one thing. I love you. I have loved you since that first night with the contract. I will love you for as long as I am still in this world to do the loving. I do not have the right to ask you for anything. You came up this mountain by an accident of my brother's foolishness, and you stayed because you are a better person than any of us deserve. But if we live through tomorrow and you choose of your own free will, and against all reason to remain in this house, then I will spend the rest of my days trying to be the kind of man who is worth that choice. The fire cracked once in the grate. Charlotte rose from her place. She walked around the long table. She did not stop when she reached him, and he did not stand. She came to stand in front of him where he sat, and she took his rough, scarred hands in her own bandaged ones, and she lifted them and pressed them to her face, and she leaned down so that her forehead rested against his, as his had rested against hers in the kitchen on the morning after the barn fire. Then ask me Elijah Bannock, she said. He looked up at her. Stay. I will. That was all that was said. In the morning he would remember every word of it, and so would she, and they would both remember that there had been no kiss between them at the table that night, only the touch of hand to face and forehead to forehead, and the long, quiet weight of two promises, spoken plainly into the lamplight. The kiss, when it came, would belong to the next day, and to a different occasion, and to the witness of more than 100 people. But the promise belonged to that long table on the night of the fourth of the 5 days, and neither of them would ever after be able to think of the long table without thinking of it. The fifth morning came up red. Charlotte was at the kitchen window before sunrise. She had not slept much. She had risen in the dark and built up the fire and put on a heavy pot of coffee for the men, and she had laid out a cold breakfast of bread and salt pork and dried apples on the long table, and she had dressed herself in her navy blue traveling dress with the lace at the collar and the small cameo brooch at her throat. She had brushed her honey-colored hair out and pinned it up in a simple knot at the back of her head, and she had washed her face in cold water from the basin. She had looked at herself once in the small mirror over the washstand. The cornflower blue eyes that looked back at her were not afraid. The sun came up over the eastern ridge a little after 7, and the light fell across the home pasture in long bars of pink and gold, and the snow blazed under it like beaten silver. It was the kind of morning that the high country gives you only a few times in a winter, a morning so beautiful that the beauty itself feels like a kind of warning, as if the world were arranging its best gifts on the table because it knew it was about to take something from you in exchange. She went out onto the front porch a little after 9. Elijah was already there. He was wearing a clean dark shirt and a long charcoal coat, and the 2 Colt peacemakers were holstered at his belt, and the Winchester carbine rested upright against the porch rail at his right hand. He did not turn when she came out. He was looking south down the long road toward the lower meadow gate. They are coming, he said. She looked. Far down the road where the trail curved out of the timber, a thin column of dust had begun to rise. The dust caught the morning light. Within the dust, she could see the small, dark shapes of riders strung out in single file, 8 of them, climbing slowly toward the home pasture. What time is it? 9:30. They are early. Grimshaw wanted to catch us before we had finished our morning work. He wanted us tired and split up between the buildings. He has misjudged us. He has misjudged us. Jonah came out onto the porch carrying the Henry repeater and the loaded 10-gauge shotgun, and he handed the shotgun to Charlotte without ceremony and took up his own position at the south corner of the porch with the rifle resting easy across his forearm. Caleb came out a moment later. His right arm was still in the sling, but in his left hand, he carried the second Henry rifle that had belonged to their father, and he had been practicing one-handed with that rifle for 2 days under Jonah's eye, and the look on his face was the look of a young man who had decided what he was for. He took his position at the north corner of the porch. The 4 of them stood in a line on the long log house's front porch and watched the dust come up the road. The 8 riders pulled up at the lower meadow gate exactly 100 yards from the front of the house. They did not come through the gate. They sat their horses in a loose half-moon on the road, and their breath made small white clouds in the cold morning air, and after a moment one of them, a man on a tall gray horse, walked his animal forward alone toward the house. Silas Grimshaw rode the 50 yards to within 40 yards of the porch. He stopped. He held up one gloved hand in a gesture that mocked the sign of peace. "Bannock, time is up. Open this gate and ride out of here this morning, and no one will be hurt. My associates will give you safe escort to the Silver Pine train station, and you will be on your way to whatever sorry future you can build for yourselves. Refuse, and the law of the territory of Colorado will take its course." Elijah Bannock did not answer. Charlotte Winslow did. She stepped down from the porch. She did not look back at the three brothers behind her. She walked across the bare ground of the home pasture in her navy blue dress, with her honey-colored hair pinned up neatly in the morning sun, and the folded indictment she had written 4 days before was in her right hand. The shotgun she had been carrying was leaning now against the porch rail behind her because she did not want to be holding a weapon for what she was about to do. She walked the length of the open ground at a steady, measured pace, and she did not stop until she stood 10 paces in front of Silas Grimshaw's gray horse. Behind her on the porch, Elijah Bannock had moved one step forward, and his hand had gone to the grip of the right hand cold at his belt, and Jonah had hissed her name once under his breath. She did not turn. She did not need to turn. She had made her decision before she walked out the front door, and she trusted the three Bannock brothers with her life, and she trusted herself with the next 2 minutes of it. She lifted the folded paper. Silas Grimshaw. Her voice carried in the cold, thin air as a courtroom voice carries, and it carried not because she was shouting, because she was not, but because every word in it had been chosen and ordered as her father had taught her to order words. "My name is Charlotte Winslow. I am the daughter of Edmund Winslow of Philadelphia. The paper in my hand is a sworn statement of the federal crimes you have committed against this family in the past 60 days and against 11 other families in this valley in the past 2 years. The statement names you in the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad and the Shell Corporations, Rocky Mountain Surety, and Western Mineral Holdings as parties to a conspiracy of fraud forgery and conspiracy to commit murder. The statement attaches a forged loan note bearing the name of Josiah Bannock, dated the 14th of September, 1876, more than 2 months after Josiah Bannock had been rendered incapable of writing his own name by a paralytic stroke witnessed by a doctor whose deposition I will obtain. The statement attaches a witness signature in your own hand dated the 12th of September, 1876, which precedes the date of the document you claim to have witnessed by 2 days. The statement is at this hour in the hands of United States Marshal Augustus Whitaker of the Denver District, and Marshal Whitaker is, I have every reason to believe, on the road to this ridge as I'm speaking." Grimshaw's friendly mouth had thinned to a line. His pale eyes had not moved off her face. "You little fool. You are out here on a mountain in the middle of nowhere telling stories to an empty sky. There is no marshal coming. There is no telegram. There is no help. You walked into a place that does not have any law in it but the law I bring with me, and now you are going to find out what that law looks like." He half turned in the saddle. He raised his right hand. "Deacon, take the woman." The lean, tall man with the dirty ice eyes walked his horse 3 steps forward, out of the line of the 7 gunmen at the gate, and he drew the right-hand pistol from his belt with the slow, calm motion of a man who had drawn that pistol on perhaps 300 other mornings in his working life, and he leveled it at the small navy blue figure of Charlotte Winslow standing on the open ground. That was the moment the rifle shot came from the north. It came from high above and behind the house, from the long timbered ridge that closed off the home pasture at its northern end, and the bullet did not hit a man, and it did not hit a horse. It hit the road. It struck the frozen ground exactly 6 inches in front of the right forehoof of Deacon Meredith's horse, and it threw up a small, bright fan of ice and gravel, and the horse shied violently to the left, and the pistol in Deacon Meredith's hand jerked offline. Every face in the home pasture turned at once toward the sound. On the long bare crest of the northern ridge, black against the rising morning sun behind them, 12 mounted men had topped the rise in a single line. The first of them was a tall older man on a heavy bay gelding, and on the breast of his long dark coat the morning sun caught a five-pointed star of polished brass and threw it back in a small, cold flash that traveled all the way across the home pasture to the eyes of the 7 gunmen at the gate. The voice that came down off the ridge was the voice of a man who had spent 30 years giving orders in places where orders were not always obeyed. Silas Grimshaw, this is United States Marshal Augustus Whitaker of the Denver District. By the authority of the Federal Court of the Colorado Territory, you are under arrest on charges of land fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit murder, and the interstate hiring of armed men for unlawful purposes. Your hired men are to lay down their weapons. Any man who does not is a dead man inside the next minute. The 7 gunmen at the gate looked up at the 12 riders on the ridge above them, and then they looked at one another, and then they looked at Deacon Meredith. Deacon Meredith did not look up at the ridge. He looked at Charlotte Winslow. He raised his pistol again and brought it back onto her. What happened in the next 8 seconds happened so quickly that Charlotte Winslow afterward could only put it together in her memory as one puts together the pieces of a broken mirror, holding each piece up separately to the light. Elijah Bannock cleared the porch steps in 2 strides with the right hand, Colt already out of its holster, and the hammer already back, and his voice ripped across the home pasture in a single word that was Charlotte's name. Jonah Bannock at the south corner of the porch fired the Henry rifle from the shoulder one-handed, without bothering to bring it up to his cheek, and the man at the right end of the line of 7 gunmen, the one who had begun to draw a Sharp's carbine across his saddle, went off the back of his horse without making any sound at all. And at the north corner of the porch, the youngest brother, the one with the soft summer blue eyes and the broken arm in a sling, and the second Henry rifle held one-handed in his good left arm, the one who had never fired a weapon at a human being in 22 years of life on this earth, sighted carefully along the barrel and fired one single shot. The bullet entered the right shoulder of Deacon Meredith just below the collarbone, and the pistol that had been pointed at Charlotte Winslow's heart fell from his fingers into the road, and Deacon Meredith made a sound that was not a word and slumped sideways in his saddle. Caleb Bannock would tell that story for the rest of his long life when his own grandchildren asked him about the morning on the home pasture, and he would always end the telling with the same sentence: "I did not shake. The first time I ever pointed a rifle at a man, I did not shake because I had seen him point his at my sister." The other 6 gunmen at the gate had begun to scatter, but the 12 riders on the ridge above were already coming down the long slope at a hard gallop with their carbines out, and Elijah Bannock and Jonah Bannock were already off the porch and crossing the open ground at a run, and the half-minute of fighting that followed was not really a fight at all, but the closing of a trap that had been set on both ends at once. 2 of the gunmen threw down their weapons and raised their hands. 2 more tried to mount and ride and were brought down off their horses by carbine fire from the marshal's deputies sweeping in from the ridge. One reached for a pistol, and Elijah Bannock shot him cleanly through the right shoulder at 30 paces with a single round from the Colt, as he had once been able to shoot at 30 paces in the Pinkerton training yard in Chicago, and the man went down clutching his arm and screaming. The last man, the one closest to Silas Grimshaw, made the worst decision of his life and turned his pistol towards Charlotte one more time, and Jonah Bannock fired the Henry from the hip and put him down for good. Silas Grimshaw himself made no move. He sat on his tall gray horse with his pale eyes very wide and his gloved hands held up in front of him at the height of his ears, and he watched his hired men fall around him, and he understood with the small late clarity that came to such men only when the trap had already closed, that he had walked his entire fortune up a Colorado mountain into a room where a young woman in a navy blue dress had been waiting for him with the law in her right hand. When the last of the firing had stopped, Charlotte was still standing in exactly the place where she had stopped to read the indictment. She had not moved. The folded paper was still in her right hand. her honey-colored hair, and it was still pinned neatly at the back of her head. The small cameo brooch was still at her throat. Her cornflower blue eyes were calm and very wide and very bright. Elijah Bannock came across the open ground to her at a walk that turned halfway into something faster than a walk. He reached her. He did not stop. He took her in both arms and lifted her right off her feet and pressed his face into the side of her hair, and she felt his whole great frame shaking against her, and she understood that the shaking was not fear of what had just happened, but the relief of a man who had come within 8 seconds of losing the last thing in the world he had agreed to love. "You walked out there," he said into her hair. "You walked out there alone, Charlotte. You walked out there alone." "I walked out there knowing the three of you were behind me," she said. "I have never walked out anywhere less alone in my life." He set her down on her feet. He looked down at her in the morning light. The whiskey eyes were wet, and they were not ashamed to be wet. He bent his head, and right there on the open ground of the home pasture at Bannock Ridge, with 12 federal deputies and 7 hired killers, and 1 disgraced railroad agent, and his own 2 brothers, all watching Elijah, Bannock kissed Charlotte Winslow on the mouth for the first time. The kiss was not long. It did not need to be. It said what the night before at the long table had said, and it set its seal upon it, and Charlotte felt the seal and answered it with the soft pressure of her own bandaged hand against the side of his face. The deputies on the ridge sent up a low, rough cheer. United States Marshal Augustus Whitaker came down off the ridge last of all, walking his big bay at a steady pace, and he dismounted in front of the porch with the slow, stiff care of a man past 60 years of age who had ridden too many hours through cold weather. He was tall and silver-haired, with a long face deeply scored by weather and by other things, and the cold blue eyes that looked out of that face were the eyes of a man who had spent his life looking into the worst of human nature and had not yet decided to be defeated by what he had seen. He came up to where Elijah and Charlotte were standing. He took off his hat. "Miss Winslow, Marshal, your father was a friend of mine. I worked with him on the Wyoming land cases 6 years back. He told me once that his daughter had the better legal mind of the 2 Winslows. I did not believe him at the time. I am willing to believe him now." He put his hat back on. "Whatever you wrote in that telegram you sent me from Silver Pine, it was the most complete and most useful piece of intelligence on a railroad fraud case that has crossed my desk in 15 years. We had been looking for a hook to hang Silas Grimshaw on for 2 years. You handed us the rope and the gallows together. Your father would be proud of you, child. I am proud of you on his behalf." Charlotte's eyes filled then for the first time that morning. She did not let the tears fall. She only nodded once, and she said very quietly, "Thank you, Marshal." The deputies had Silas Grimshaw and Deacon Meredith in the surviving gunmen in irons inside 10 minutes. They were taken down the mountain that same afternoon under heavy escort, and they would not be seen on a free road again. Silas Grimshaw was tried in federal court in Denver in the spring of 1879 on 6 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of the interstate hiring of armed men for unlawful purposes, and he was convicted on every count and sentenced to 18 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, where he would die of pneumonia in the winter of his 11th year. Deacon Meredith would be hanged in Denver on a clear morning in May of 1880, and the rope around his neck would be tied by a hangman who had once buried a brother killed in a Texas land dispute by men of Deacon Meredith's own kind. The Transcontinental Pacific Railroad would pay a federal settlement of $47,000 to the 11 dispossessed families of the Silver Pine Valley, and a portion of that settlement would purchase for the Bannock family the 200 adjoining acres of high meadow that bordered Bannock Ridge to the north, and the combined holding would in time become one of the largest and most respected horse and cattle ranches on the entire Front Range. But all of that was still ahead. In the meantime, on the morning after the standoff on the home pasture, while Caleb was being fussed over by Charlotte at the kitchen table for the small powder burn the Henry rifle had left on the side of his good hand, a fine black carriage came up the mountain road from Silver Pine, carrying a man in an expensive Eastern coat and a beaver hat. The man was Reginald Winslow of Philadelphia. He had traced his niece by patient inquiries at the telegraph offices of 3 cities, and he had come at last to the long log house at Bannock Ridge to take her home. He did not get past the front porch. Charlotte met him on the porch in her navy blue dress with the small cameo at her throat, and Elijah Bannock standing 1 pace behind her left shoulder, and Jonah Bannock standing 1 pace behind her right, and Caleb Bannock leaning in the open doorway behind all of them, with his arm in its sling and his blue eyes very steady. United States Marshal Augustus Whitaker was inside the house at the long table writing reports, and the badge on his chest was visible through the open doorway from where Reginald Winslow stood on the porch boards. Reginald Winslow began to speak in the smooth, careful tone of a man used to being obeyed. Oh, Charlotte cut him off in the second sentence. Uncle Reginald, I am 22 years of age. I am of full legal majority under the laws of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the laws of the Territory of Colorado. The marriage you arranged for me with Senator Halloran was a contract to which I never gave my consent, and a contract without consent is a contract void from its inception, as you know perfectly well from the bar examination you passed in 1858. You have no legal authority over my person, my property, or my future. If you attempt to remove me from this house against my will, I will file a federal complaint against you for the unlawful restraint of an adult woman, and the marshal who is sitting at that table inside will witness the filing this afternoon. Now I will ask you with the courtesy due to a member of my family to return to your carriage and to ride back down this mountain and to leave me in peace. This is my home. These are the people I have chosen. You are not welcome here. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Reginald Winslow looked at her. He looked at Elijah Bannock standing 1 pace behind her with one hand resting easy on his belt. He looked through the open doorway at the silver-haired marshal at the long table inside, and the smooth, careful expression on his face slowly came apart, and underneath the smooth, careful expression was the face of a small, unhappy man who had spent his whole life arranging the futures of other people for his own profit and had at last met the one future that had refused to be arranged. He turned without a word. He climbed back into the black carriage. He rode down the mountain road and was gone, and Charlotte Winslow watched him go from the porch of the long log house, and she did not feel triumph, and she did not feel grief. She felt only the small, clean settling of a door closing on a room she had walked out of a long time ago. They were married at the beginning of May in the year 1879, when the last of the snow had finally gone off the south-facing slopes and the wild blue lupines were beginning to come up in the home pasture. The wedding was held under the great old sugar pine on the highest knoll of Bannock Ridge, the knoll that looks south down the entire length of the Silver Pine Valley and west across the snow-tipped peaks of the Front Range. Charlotte wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself by the kitchen window through the long evenings of March and April, and her honey-colored hair was crowned with a circlet of white columbine that Caleb had ridden out at dawn to gather from the high meadows. Elijah Bannock wore the one dark suit he still owned from his Chicago years brushed and pressed for the occasion, and Jonah stood up beside him as the best man in a clean white shirt and his father's old string tie. Caleb walked Charlotte the short distance to the place under the sugar pine where the circuit preacher waited because her father was not there to walk her, and Caleb had asked for the privilege the night before with his soft summer blue eyes very serious, and she had said yes before he had finished asking. United States Marshal Augustus Whitaker stood as her witness, and afterwards Charlotte would always call him Uncle Gus. Old Dempsey from the Silver Pine Station was there, and Timothy Grundy, the land office clerk, and almost the entire town of Silver Pine had ridden up the mountain for the occasion because the story of the morning on the home pasture had spread across the Front Range in the weeks that followed, and because the 4 people standing under the sugar pine had become, without quite intending, to a kind of legend in the high country. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Elijah Bannock kissed his bride for the second time in his life, The gathered townspeople of Silver Pine sent up a cheer that went rolling away across the home pasture and up into the timber, and was answered somewhere out of sight along the high ridge by the long, lonely call of a single bull elk. Charlotte would remember the sound of that elk for the rest of her life, and she would always say that she had taken it for a benediction. The years that followed were the years she had not known to imagine. Elijah did not return to the Pinkerton agency. He had buried that part of himself once, and he had picked it up again only because the woman he loved and the brothers he loved had needed him to, and he understood that the picking up had been a necessary and temporary thing. But he did on occasion accept a quiet request from Marshal Augustus Whitaker, and he rode out for a few weeks at a time to help with a particular case, usually some matter involving a small homesteader in a large company. And on those occasions, Charlotte rode part of the way with him and helped him prepare the legal papers in the saddlebags. And the two of them worked together as they had worked together in the upstairs office during their long winter, two minds bent over the same problem in the lamplight. Their daughter Hannah was born in March of 1880, and she came into the world with the whiskey eyes of her father and the honey-colored hair of her mother, and they named her after the sister Elijah had lost in Chicago. And on the day Caleb first held her in his arms, his soft summer blue eyes filled with tears, and he could not speak for some minutes. Their son Edmund was born in July of 1882, and he was named for Charlotte's father, and he grew into a quiet, careful boy who loved the horses better than he loved anything in books, and who would in time take over the running of the home pasture from his uncles. Their second daughter, Margaret, was born in the autumn of 1885, and she had her mother's stubborn streak and her Uncle Caleb's love of drawing, and she would in time become a painter of some small fame in Denver and Santa Fe, and her landscapes of the Front Range would hang in the parlors of governors. Caleb did not marry. He stayed at Bannock Ridge and he raised the horses he had loved since boyhood, and in the long evenings he sat by the kitchen window and painted the mountains in watercolor. And his paintings, after a slow start, began to sell to the well-to-do travelers who came west on the transcontinental Pacific line in the 1890s, and the irony of his paintings being purchased with railroad money was not lost on him or on any of his family. Jonah married a young school teacher from Silver Pine in the autumn of 1881. Her name was Susanna Reed, and she stood 5 feet and 1 inch tall and possessed the practical sense of a woman who had grown up on a Kansas dirt farm, and she told Jonah Bannock to mind his temper at their first dance. And he did mind it, and they were happy together until the end of their long lives, and they had 4 children. Hannah Bannock, the eldest of Charlotte and Elijah's 3, would in the year 1898 become one of the first women admitted to the law department at the University of Denver. She would write her admissions essay on the federal land fraud cases of the Colorado Territory, and the essay would draw the close attention of the dean of the school, who had served as a young clerk on the original Grimshaw prosecution, and remembered well the name of the woman in the navy blue dress who had walked alone across an open pasture with a folded indictment in her hand. And on a warm summer evening in the year 1903, 25 years after the night Charlotte Winslow had first stepped down from a train onto the platform at Silver Pine, Charlotte, and Elijah Bannock sat together on the porch of the long log house at Bannock Ridge and watched the sun go down behind the Front Range. Her honey-colored hair had silver in it now. The cornflower blue eyes were the same eyes they had always been, and the skin around them was finely lined with all the laughter and all the weather of the 25 years between. His own dark hair had gone iron gray at the temples, and his shoulders were a little narrower than they had been in his Pinkerton years, and the whiskey eyes had not lost the steadiness she had first seen in them on the train station platform. He was 52 years old and she was 47, and they were still, by every measure that mattered to either of them, the two people they had been on the night of the long table in the lamplight. Hannah was inside at the parlor desk by the south window, 23 years old, writing a brief for her first paying client, a small farmer outside Greeley who was being pushed off his quarter section by a sugar beet syndicate. Edmund was down at the lower corral with his Uncle Jonah, working a young chestnut colt for one of the Cheyenne buyers who would come up next week. Margaret, 18 years old, sat at the far end of the porch with a board across her knees doing a watercolor sketch of how the last red light caught the southwest face of Long's Peak. Elijah's hand found Charlotte's on the arm of her chair, their fingers laced together as fingers do when they have laced together 10,000 times before. "Do you remember the night you came?" he said. "I remember it as if it were last week. Do you remember how you stood on that platform alone with the snow coming down on your bonnet, and old Dempsey could not believe you were a real woman who had really come all the way from Philadelphia? I remember thinking my life was over. I remember being absolutely certain of it. And do you remember what I said to you when I came through the door? You said you did not know who I was. I did not. God help me, Charlotte, I did not. I rode down off this mountain that night, believing I was riding down to the platform to send some lost woman back where she came from. And what I rode down to was the rest of rest of my life. The rest of my life was standing on that platform in a navy blue dress, holding a leather valise. She turned her head against the back of the chair to look at him. The last of the western light was on his face. The whiskey eyes she had first seen by the lantern of an old station master were the same eyes that looked at her now in the long blue twilight of a Colorado summer evening, and they had not changed in any way that mattered. "I have asked you this once before in this same chair on this same porch," she said. "But I am going to ask you again because I like to hear the answer. Are you sorry, Elijah Bannock, that you came down to the platform that night?" "No, Charlotte, I am not sorry." "Are you sorry that you let me read that contract aloud to you at the long table?" "No, no, Charlotte, I am not sorry." "Are you sorry that you opened the chest under your desk and put on the Colts again the morning after the Hereford cattle died?" He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him think about the question with the same care he had brought to every question she had ever asked him. "I am sorry it had to happen," he said at last. "I am not sorry I was the man who happened to be there to do it. There is a difference between those two things. You taught me the difference. I had not understood it before you came. We taught each other. That is how real love works. You told me that the second summer we were married. I remember telling you that. I still believe it." The sun went all the way down behind the Front Range. The first stars came out very bright in the thin, clean mountain air as they only ever came out at Bannock Ridge. Inside the house, Hannah was lighting an oil lamp on the parlor desk, and the warm yellow light fell out through the window onto the porch boards and made a long golden rectangle at their feet. In the lower pasture, Edmund and Jonah were leading the chestnut colt back to the barn, two tall figures and one smaller one moving slowly through the gathering blue. Charlotte Winslow Bannock leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. He turned his face into her silver-streaked, honey-colored hair, as he had turned his face into it on the morning of the standoff in the home pasture, and on every morning of every day in between. 25 years, she said quietly. I came up this mountain a girl with a single valise and a secret in my chest, and I have walked out the seasons of a quarter century, and I have raised 3 children under that roof, and I have buried no one I love except your father, who I never met, and my own father, who I had already buried before I came. I have read 1,000 contracts at that long table inside and won most of them. I have learned to ride a horse and to shoot a shotgun and to deliver a foal in a snowstorm. I have grown old enough to see my eldest daughter file her own briefs in her own hand, and I have grown young enough to still want to sit on this porch with you when the sun goes down. There is no other place in this world I have ever wanted to be, Elijah Bannock. Not from the night I read the railroad contract until tonight. There has been no other place." He kissed the top of her head. "You saved me, Charlotte. I have said it before. I will say it now in case it ever stops being true, which it will not. You walked into my house in a navy blue dress, and you saved my life and the lives of my brothers, and you gave me a family I had stopped believing I would ever have. There is no debt I can pay against that. There is no debt to pay. We saved each other. Say it the right way. We saved each other. That is right." The long log house behind them was warm with the lamps of the evening, and the long valley below them was settling into the blue dust that came down off the Rockies in summer. And somewhere in the timber, a single great horned owl began to call from its perch in a grandfather pine. The sound rolled across the home pasture and up into the dark heights of the ridge above the house, and it was answered faintly by another owl somewhere on the far side of the valley. And the two voices spoke to each other across the sleeping country between them, as two voices that have found each other in a wilderness will sometimes speak across the silence of a long, peaceful night. Charlotte closed her eyes against her husband's shoulder. She had run away from Philadelphia in a navy blue dress with a small leather valise and a folded letter in the lining of her glove, and the door she had been certain was closing on her life had turned out in the way these things sometimes turn out to have been the very door that opened onto the life she had been meant to live all along. She had not known. She could not always have known. No one ever can. But she had stepped through it anyway on a cold evening in November of 1878, and a tall, quiet man with whiskey-colored eyes had taken her up a mountain in the snow, and the two of them had built between them in the long winters and longer summers of the years that followed a thing larger and stronger and more loving than either of them could have imagined alone. She opened her eyes one more time and looked up into the deepening Colorado sky where the stars were now coming out in their thousands. I love you, Elijah. I love you too, Charlotte. Always have. Always will. The owls in the timber called once more to each other across the summer dark, and the long log house at Bannock Ridge stood quiet and warm against the great shoulder of the mountain, and the small lamp in the parlor window glowed steady and yellow into the night. And that was the end of the story of the girl who had stepped off a train at Silver Pine in the November of 1878, and of the cowboy who had not known her name when he came down off his mountain to meet her, and of the long good life the two of them had made together in the high country between.